Chappie Gerardino, who is of course well known to most of you. Chappie is originally from Chile, but she has spent most of her research life in Southern Africa. She completed her doctorate on the archaeological shell middens of Elands Bay and Lambert's Bay areas of the west coast of UCT. And she's of course contributed enormously to the study of later Stone Age hunter-gatherers in that region, you know, really helping us to overhaul and rethink the archaeological agendas in that region. She's certainly one of the leading experts on the study of archaeological shellfish in South Africa, having also worked extensively on sites on both the southern and now also the eastern coasts of South Africa. But today she's going to present an overview of mid-Holocene climate change and human resilience on the west coast. So Chappie, if you're ready to share.
Right. I hope to be doing the right thing now. Right. Here we go.
That looks good.
Okay. Well, this is about the Mid-Holocene, which is a period that has been quite elusive until recently, especially on the west coast. But already in 1974, Jeanette Deacon already showed that in the interior of Southern Africa, which is behind this insect, there was also an absence of occupation during the Mid-Holocene. This has got to do mainly because of very arid conditions. We're going to describe this later, soon after. And it affected mainly the west coast and also the interior. And as we know here, that there are very clear changes or trend in less precipitation towards the north, which affects very clearly the west coast. That was not the case on the south coast, where many shell middens and other archaeological sites date to the Mid-Holocene. So about 30 or 20 years ago, there were two sites, Tortoise Cave and Elands Bay Cave, that informed archaeological observations there, that informed the sequence, the cultural sequence. And well, now in terms of calibrated dates, the Mid-Holocene is regarded to have happened between 8,200 and 4,200. It's a 4,000-year period, which is very substantial, at least in terms of the Holocene archaeology. It consisted of higher atmospheric temperature, low precipitation, that is, increase in aridity because of the reduction in vegetation cover. And very importantly, also higher sea levels, and this has been established both by geological observations and various other proxies. So here in the Elands Bay area, that meant that higher sea levels brought estuarine conditions to the Verloren Vlei mouth, which is this one here, right there. So that is basically what happened. It is important also to emphasize that this Mid-Holocene period that was reflected in a sort of lack of evidence, lack of human occupation, lack of human visitation was also detected elsewhere in the world, in North America and South America, parts of Australia. So it's not a phenomenon restricted to South Africa. But as time went on and further projects were undertaken, Mid-Holocene occupations were found dated at other places, at other sites, other shell middens, including in places where excavation had already taken place, and that is because of the use of calibrated dates And here we have in Eland's Bay Cave, for instance, a presence of late Mid-Holocene, of early Mid-Holocene, and then in Tortoise Cave we have a little early phase and a later phase in the Mid-Holocene. But the middle of the Mid-Holocene is not present here. But for instance, at the very bottom of Untitled Midden, in a layer called shelly pebbly sand below the wad of shell middens that characterizes the well-known site of Untitled Midden. It's a site excavated by John Parkinson and students, but the Mid-Holocene level has been studied by Jason Auden. We've done work in Steenbokfontein, and we find here evidence for the middle of the Mid-Holocene, and then 2 other shell middens further north. This has been published as a result of CRM work. CRM is Cultural Resource Management, and this hasn't been published, but soon will be, also as a result of impact assessment. So basically the Mid-Holocene here is represented in other sites where most volumes are greatest. Mid-Holocene dated material, the volumes are greatest in Steenbokfontein and Deurspring 16. So most of our insights into the Mid-Holocene have come from these 2 sites. But we're going to talk about in this presentation about Steenbokfontein results. So clearly we have Mid-Holocene visits to the central west coast, but these, as I shall describe, were rather either infrequent or undertaken by small numbers of people. This is to show the location of Steenbokfontein. It's on this copy. This is the cave, looking sort of facing northwest actually, yes. And this shows you on the bottom left the size of the cave, which is slightly smaller than Eland's Bay Cave. And it's about 2 kilometers away from the shoreline. In terms of, in terms of the stratigraphy, these are uncalibrated dates. Sorry, I haven't put the calibrated ones. But it shows you that there's a sequence so far excavated, and layer 5A dates to the Mid-Holocene between these 2 thick lines. So this date, if calibrated, would be around 5,000. There's quite a bit of a difference, and here it's even bigger, the difference, about 6,800, round about there. And here we've got the beginning of the early Holocene. So if we want to excavate more of this material, we will have to go sideways. This section is basically parallel with the back wall. So we're looking towards the entrance of the cave, so to speak. We're going to show now some results. For instance, mobility. What we have here, we're showing here what the lithic raw materials show us, and it's based on silkreed and specularite, the presence and the quantities, the abundances. Silkreed, for instance, is found here at the Olifants River mouth or at the mouth of the Berg River. And during the Holocene, we have higher numbers, much greater percentages of exotic raw materials represented in silkreed. as compared to the late Holocene. Okay, there's a 6.4%, but this belongs to a very small, say small, the sample size is small for a particular layer, quite late in the late Holocene. So largely we're comparing 7.9 or 8% against below 5%. And in terms of micaceous pigments such as specularite, and this was identified years ago with people, I mean, I'm not a lithic person, obviously, but this was identified by people who knew the mineralogical composition of this material. The nearest source for specularite is in the Northwest Province, for those who live in South Africa. And it's about roughly 730 kilometers away as the crow flies, so to speak. But obviously this must have come through via networks, who knows, zigzagging, very difficult to say how it actually ended up here. However, obviously other sources of mica and specularite might be closer, but still beyond 100 kilometers, most certainly. So it's a long haul. Yeah, so there are indications, therefore, there are indications of long distance networks. We don't think that people were traveling especially to go and get specularite and back to the coast. I mean, that's not how things go. So long distance networks travel and exchange, a combination of all of that will have brought that material to the cave. Obviously, much of it was used, probably, and ethnographic and ethnohistorical record shows it was used actually to beautify oneself, you know, to put it in the hair, including males. And so there might be some component in which people exchanged it in Steenbokfontein or used it for special occasions. Now, networks are very important as a way to minimize risk, as we know very well, and minimize risk in terms of environmental deterioration, which is clearly the case for the Mid-Holocene, or the unpredictability of resources, the availability of it, and distribution on the landscape. So, so in a way, also importantly, it's a continuation of the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene pattern in which, in terms of networks, because we see here also the coming of hornfels or indurated shells from the interior areas to the coast. And that continued in the later on and in the Mid-Holocene, but with other material. Okay, let's go now into subsistence, the results. Here we built a ratio of shell and terrestrial fauna. We basically use densities to calculate this. If you have a ratio of densities, you end up actually with a ratio of shell and terrestrial fauna in terms of weight or in terms of mass. So clearly here what we have in the Mid-Holocene more consumption of terrestrial fauna. In terms of much of it is local prey, with the greatest emphasis on small bovids. Steenbok is also small bovid, rock hyrax and Cape fur seal. Those were the main prey. Angela fortis is also represented there, but mostly this is where foraging efforts were directed towards. In terms of tortoise sizes, through a proxy by measuring humeri, this is Richard Klein data, we can see here that the sizes of tortoises are quite large. These are fairly large little animals here compared to the late Holocene, not as large as during the MSA, during the Middle Stone Age. The Middle Stone Age would be around there. But it suggests that the numbers of people or the intensity of predation was not as high as later on during the late Holocene. These are late Holocene, particularly here 4A is 3,500, 3B is already 3,000 or 2,700. We also find, which is supported also by another Mid-Holocene site, that is Geospring 16. When we build a ratio of MNI of cake rock lobsters and shell mass, we can see there is a greater emphasis in the procurement of cake rock lobsters as compared to mollusks when compared to the late Holocene. And when we look at the sizes of rock lobster, they are also quite large specimens. And again, the same trend in which late Holocene sizes become smaller and smaller, with certain instances of bouncing back and then slightly smaller again, which suggests, well, this is L and R for left and right, because the reconstruction of full carapace size is based on the mandibles, and the mandibles are not of equal size in the animal. So, but more or less that the crosses are means and the lines are medians. Yeah, so this more or less shows also if people are responsible for variation in lobster sizes as well as tortoises, then the conclusion is that predation during the Mid-Holocene was not as high as later on in the late Holocene. So already one can see that shellfish consumption during the Mid-Holocene is a complement to a largely terrestrial diet. And so what happens then to the mollusks, as usual and as with most other shellmans elsewhere, largely these are rocky shore species, but during the Mid-Holocene there is a 6% made by sand-dwelling and sand-tolerant species, such as Donaxera and Veneruppus corrugatus. Donaxera lives in wave-exposed shoreline, and Veneruppus nestles among mussels in sandy areas, and also burrows in shallow sand and sheltered sandbanks. So there is a 6% there made by these two species, specifically in the Mid-Holocene. Here we must look then at the palaeoenvironmental conditions, what was happening with sea level. This is a sea level curve after Compton, 2006. What is being shown by these red dots is the liberation of a lot of sediment during transgressive sea levels. As sea levels approach the current shoreline, more or less symbolized here by present mean sea level, what it does, it scours, it cleans off, so to speak, sediment, it mobilizes it out of where it was lying before, it erodes it away, coastal erosional process as described here, and all of it gets liberated, and around this time there is a lot of sediment moving around, and we've shown archaeological proxies for that as well, which I'm not going to go into now. but that has been published, and we can deal with that later if anybody has a question. So the main point here is that during this period and before, there was a lot of sediment moving about on the rocks where people were collecting shellfish. So, and this has implications obviously for shellfish, because some shellfish are tolerant and some shellfish, many actually, especially gastropods, are not tolerant to sediment. So what it says here, black mussels can live in sediment-covered rocks, as shown in this photograph, but the absorption of food is slower than under conditions when sediments are in lower supply. This is so because energy must be expended in order to separate food particles from inorganic sediment. Yeah? It can't just take it all in and separate it in the gut. So it has to be separated. I mean, it gets separated in the gut part of it, but it all needs energy expenditure. And if you take energy, that means less energy for growth. Therefore, growth rates are affected negatively under these conditions, and smaller mussels would be overall more common among colonies where sediments are more abundant. And this is what we get during the Mid-Holocene and immediately afterwards, around 4,000 years ago. What we have is the smallest of all black mussels around this time. In fact, and as we were describing the sea level curve, we would expect also in the early Holocene to have small mussels, because sea levels were transgressing at that time, and that is effectively the case. Indeed, early Holocene are even smaller mussels here, and terminal Pleistocene are more or less the size. What happens then to gastropods, which are not tolerant of sediments? You know, in a situation with this, like this, where sediments are largely not present, that means there's more space among gastropods in general. You know, there are ecological situations in which it gets hell of a crowded. But in general, if surface is not too limited, there will be space between limpets and some of the whelks here. But in Rockashore, where sediments abound, and this is an exaggerated situation, obviously, crowding sets in. You know, we can see here how limpets are trying to avoid that sandy patch, and obviously here as well. There is a way, but theoretically there would be a way to, based on limpet data, to see whether we have a crowded situation or an uncrowded situation, but sample sizes are not helping really. So another way of determining how crowded the intertidal was is to look at the epibionts. And epibionts like Crepidula and Halcyon can live both on rocks and on top of the hosts. We have here also subadults that cling on their adults, on adult shells. That's very common. But the expectation is that more epibionts should be found per host under high sediment abundances, yeah, because gastropods cannot live on rocks that have too much sediment, so they flee, so to speak, on top of other bigger shells that are free of sediment. So we see here a sort of exaggerated situation in which we have lots of crepidulars and some halcyons on top of mussels. And these are the results for Steenbokfontein, where we have both lots of porcellana, crepidular porcellana and halcyon Kerry in the Mid-Holocene samples. And this is quantified as MNI per 1,000 MNI of shells, so not just limpets, but any shells, because I have seen both halcyons and crepidular on top of whelks as well. And what do other sites say? Well, very similarly as well. We have crepidula, and this is the situation we just described, and this is for Tortoise Cave.
Sorry, Chappie, just we are running a few minutes past now.
Okay,
So
this is the last one. Just to show basically that we have a similar situation here, in which crepidula is very high in Mid-Holocene levels, and even also in early Holocene levels where samples have been taken. And these are the conclusions that anybody can read if they want to. And yeah, we can carry on with the next presentation or ask some questions, whatever you decide.
That was wonderful. Thanks, Chappie. It really highlights how complex these size records are, and it was great to see how you brought in all these different lines of evidence. I think we will have to move on because we're running a few minutes late in case people join for later talks. But there is time at the end of all of this to ask questions. So please, you can pop your questions in the chat if you think you might forget it, or just note it down for afterwards. So our next speaker is Alisoun House. She is another regular at the SASQUA meetings. And as a paleobotanist, her early research and training was actually on the study of pollen structure. She's currently based at the ESI at Wits, where she's keeping this very valuable and, as she points out, somewhat neglected skill of charcoal identification going. So following in the footsteps of some very esteemed paleoecologists in Southern Africa. Today, she's going to give us a crash course in the value of charcoal studies for archaeologists and some thoughts, I think, on how to potentially improve the discipline. Take it away, Alice.
Okay, you'll have to tell me if this is working. Oops.
Looks good. You can pop it in presenter mode if you want, but it looks good.
It doesn't seem to want to do that. Let me see. Let's see. I don't know why. Anyway, maybe I just have to keep it like this.
Okay, we can see it.
Does that matter?
No, we can see it.
I don't know. For some reason, it doesn't. Sorry?
May I just suggest, sometimes it's because when you select the screen you want to show, you only selected the PowerPoint window instead of the monitor. And if you try it again, that might fix the problem.
Okay, so should I do stop sharing and then let's see. Okay.
Just be careful when you look at them to make sure you're sharing the whole screen and not just the PowerPoint window.
Let's see this.
So if you go to view.
Okay. No, okay, wait, let me just try this once. Or new share. Okay, this one. Here we go. And so this is the whole screen. Okay. Okay, let me try this one and see if that works better.
Here we go. That looks good.
Okay, sorry.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks.
Okay. Right. So, well, for the past 4 years, I have been working on identifying archaeological charcoal from a number of South African sites under the supervision of Professor Marion Bamford. And this presentation is just a brief overview on some of my thoughts and the studies that I have conducted over this time. Okay, let me just go like this and see. Yeah. Okay, so charcoal is one of the most frequently recovered items from archaeological deposits associated with past human habitations of almost any age. And since the anatomy of wood is preserved even after it has been burnt, it is possible to use these features to identify the taxonomic group of trees from which the charcoal has been derived. If we assume that the charcoal was brought into the site by the inhabitants of the site and that it was sourced locally, because nobody wants to drag something for hundreds of kilometers, and by locally I also mean within 20 kilometers of the site, this relatively new science called anthropology may be now used to contribute to, first of all, reconstructing past vegetation and thereby inferring the changing in the climate and the prevailing climate at the time. And it also helps us understand human behavior, which is associated with the selection of certain woody species for specific purposes. Because different woods have different properties, and therefore they have different suitabilities for certain tasks. So I've studied the charcoal from a number of archaeological sites, and as we know, South Africa is a very biodiverse region, and most of these sites were located in different vegetation regions. First of all, the first site that I looked at was an early Iron Age site in the lower Tukela Valley of KwaZulu-Natal. Ndondondwane is at the moment surrounded by sclerocarya, which is always known as marula, and acacia vegetation, and it falls within the subescarpment savanna biome. The second site was Blombos Cave, which is in the lower eastern slopes of the Kuruman Hills in the Northern Cape. It's in the southern Kalahari bushveld region and overlooks the Gaap Plateau. Waterfall Bluff Rock Shelter in Mapondeland, Eastern Cape Province. It is situated in what is known as the Wild Coast, within the Indian Ocean coastal belt, and in close proximity to this rock shelter is savanna, forest, and grassland biomes. Lastly, I'm presently looking at the charcoal from Burmplast Cave. This is situated in the Kango Valley in the Western Cape in the Klein Karoo region. So Ndondondwane is a special site because it represents a single short-term occupation within the time period of about 750 AD to 950 AD. And it is unique because it was only occupied once, and this makes it an ideal site to study for cultural and social settlement organization because there is no contamination from later occupations. This site has been extensively excavated in terms of archaeological research by, as you can see there, by various researchers. But our work was the first to analyze the charcoal from the site. The majority of the charcoal, more than 90% of the charcoal assemblage, was identified to 6 different species representing the genus previously known as Acacia. Mostly the species Acacia carew, or as it's now known, Vachelia carew. Ndondondwani was organized into various areas of activity. As you can see on the bottom left-hand corner, there was a charcoal preparation area, various homesteads, and also what was important was a dung area, which is represents a cattle kraal or cattle byre. And this area yielded most of the charcoal from this site. Acacia carew was identified as the most prevalent species that was isolated or identified from the cattle byre. So this indicated that this thorny wood was preferentially selected and therefore provided evidence for the usage of a specific woody species for a particular purpose, which was for constructing the cattle enclosure. And this corresponds to modern sites where these woody species are used to enclose cattle, areas where cattle are thorny species, sorry, where they are used to enclose cattle, where cattle are kept. Okay. Vonderwerk Cave is situated in the arid interior of South Africa. This site provides a unique and valuable chronological record of past environmental fluctuations and responding human behavioral adaptations, spanning over 2 million years. And it also includes the earliest evidence of controlled use of fire to about 1 million years ago. I just looked at the charcoal from the Holocene layers, and most of the species identified from these layers are those that tolerate hot, dry conditions. And this signals an arid trend during the Holocene area. One species that was most frequently identified within the strata and throughout the whole Holocene strata of this cave was Cercia lancea. This species still grows in the area today and has a wide distribution in southern Africa, as you can see from the distribution map. And it is the wood is good for burning, and the fruit, although it is small, is edible and is used for making traditional beer. So also, just by the way, there was evidence that the species identified in the charcoal showed that there was evidence of a wetter period that occurred at about 6,200 years ago, which corresponds to the pollen data, which showed similar climate changes or conditions. Waterfall Bluff rock shelter was recently excavated, and a multi-proxy palaeoenvironmental study was conducted where they combined macrobotanical remains, including charcoal, with phytoliths, pollen, plant waxes, all derived from the same archaeological record. This study aims to understand the interactions between hunter-gatherer plant foraging and climate and environmental change during the MIS3, the LGM, and then the transition into the early Holocene. The charcoal showed that the inhabitants of Waterfall Bluff rock shelter foraged the coast during glacial periods to collect wood, as a number of coastal forest species were identified in the charcoal assemblage. As you can see along the bottom, those are some of the species that have been identified. And this is even though, unlike today, the coast was about 8 kilometers distant from the site at the time. Okay, so now the last one that I'm presently in the process looking at is Burmplast Cave charcoal. This site was extensively excavated by Deacon in the 1990s and has now recently been reopened by Justin Pargeter. Deacon's research also, by the way, pioneered the multidisciplinary approach to archaeological studies with the analysis of archaeological charcoal, pollen, micromammal remains and sediments. And so we are in the process of revisiting this charcoal assemblage. It is a very rich and extensive charcoal assemblage. The charcoal was described and identified in the past by Anton Scholz in his master's thesis in 1986. And so far, because I've only just started, one thing that I can say I have found is that he also found was Protea species, which has very distinctive wood, and Salix, or the Cape willow. Right. So just having a look at some of the methods just briefly. Because of the nature of charcoal being solid chunks, we have to use reflective light to examine it. And then also because it is three-dimensional and not, flat, we have to use extended focal imaging to photograph and extended focal imaging software to photograph and examine the archaeological specimens. Then after that, we then compare, or a crucial step in identifying the charcoal relies on being able to compare the charcoal specimens to a comparative modern reference charcoal collection. We must match up the anatomical features to those that have been accurately identified specimens in the modern charcoal reference collection. So, if the modern reference charcoal collections are big enough and robust enough, and we can match our charcoal, archaeological charcoal, to a specimen in the modern reference charcoal collection, we have a chance of being able to identify the charcoal to species level. This is just at the side. From what all our studies have shown us, like for instance at Ndundondwani, we can show that the inhabitants were selecting thorny species to construct cattle enclosures. At Waterfall Bluff, we can show that the inhabitants were collecting wood from up to 8 kilometers distant from their site. And at Blombos Cave, we can track climatic changes through the Holocene by looking at the charcoal, by identifying the charcoal. But all this comes from being able to accurately identify the charcoal. So without a very good modern reference sample to compare the archaeological charcoal to, this is not really possible. And so our current focus, therefore, also includes an attempt to build up this modern reference collection and to encourage sharing of the data so that this can give us more accurate identifications. South Africa, as you know, is a very biodiverse area. In the top left-hand corner, there is a forest in the northern hemisphere, which is largely comprised of about 3 different species: spruce, pine, and fir. Underneath, we have a few pictures from some areas in South Africa. The scarp and riverine forests in the Free State, the rainforests from Knysna, and some savanna areas, as you can see. there are about 2,000 or more native tree species in South Africa. And in order to be able to accurately identify our archaeological charcoal, we need to build up this modern reference charcoal collection. Okay, so because our biodiversity increases the challenge of accurate identification, and the only way we can really identify our charcoal is by being able to compare it directly to a specimen in the modern reference collection. A lot of work has been done in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Americas, Australia, and a lot of these online databases that we use to identify our charcoal is geared towards these areas and not towards our vegetation in South Africa. So that's why in South Africa, what we need to do is build up and standardize the way we formulate these modern reference collections and share our material so that we all have a much better opportunity of building up this work, accurately identifying the charcoal, and then using it to interpret the data that we get from the modern reference. I mean, from the archaeological charcoal from all these different sites. Okay, so I think that's it. But I just wanted to say thanks to SASQUA and to Lynn and Emma for making this possible and allowing us to share our work, and also to Marion for mentoring me over the last few years. Thank you very much. Sorry, so I can stop my share.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alison. That was great. Really gave a sense of the challenges that you have to face. We possibly have time for one quick question, but if it's a substantial question, it might be better to save it for...
Sorry, Emma, can I just make a quick announcement? Slight technical issue that we might encounter at 5 o'clock is that I had to run home because there's unexpectedly load shedding on campus, and the SASQUA comms that's hosting the Zoom account, this meeting, is still logged in on campus, and I'm not sure what's going to happen if all the power goes out and the Wi-Fi dies. So if suddenly we all lose each other at 5 o'clock, just click back on the link and I'll load it up again from home. So I am here. So bear with us if that happens. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it won't.
Great, thanks. That's a very helpful announcement.
Gotta love ESCOM. Thanks, Trevor.
Okay, well, so perhaps we'll move on to the next talk.
I think let's move on to the next talk and see.
And then, please, everybody just come back on if there's any disasters. So next we have Margie Seaman. Margit is a member of the hugely impressive Sapiens team in Bergen, and she's part of the Berknes Center, I hope I'm saying that right, Center for Climate Research. And her research has deployed these cutting-edge geochemistry methods on some really spectacular marine sedimentary archives. But today she's going to be presenting some, I think, new results on leaf wax isotopes from Blombos Cave with a number of other researchers. So thank you very much, Margit.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm starting up to share. That might take a little bit of time.
Yeah, we can see your screen. We've got your... there we go.
This should be good now, right?
That looks good, yeah.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone. And as Emma was saying, I'm going to present some terrestrial evidence that is kind of new to me, like a newbie in the working in the archaeological sites. Some of you might know my marine work. And leaf waxes have obviously a long history in being recovered from marine sediment cores, and I think among other among other proxies we use to reconstruct hydroclimate from marine archives, I think applying them in the archaeological sites can kind of help the disciplines to come closer together. So I'm going to present some of that data, and I want to talk about Blombos Cave, and some of you might know Blombos Cave, but here you have a drone image of Blombos Cave while getting ready to be excavated. It's on a higher elevation, probably the reason why it has been nicely preserved and being sheltered from sea level changes over time. And people that have been there probably know, and all of you South Africans, of course, situated on a beautiful coastline with a nice walk to get there if you choose to hike. And so, yeah, very nice location to work. Just a brief introduction where we are located. Blombos Cave is in the southern coastal year-round rainfall zone, here indicated with the star, and it is located in terms of vegetation mainly in the fynbos area, but there's also some karoo and albany thicket around it. It is obviously wedged between the winter rainfall zone and the summer rainfall zone to the east, and that becomes interesting once we look at the interpretation of the data. Blombos itself obviously is mainly fynbos, and that's probably what we would expect when we look at the reconstructions of the vegetations there. Just to get you back into the archaeological context for those that are not so familiar with it. So here you have a on-the-wall archaeological sequence view. This is from Chris's 2018 paper where the interpreted oldest drawing was presented, and you see that from the bottom to the top, we're progressing in time with the oldest strata in the bottom and the youngest strata that Blombos is having on the top, that ultimately was sealed off around 68,000 years plus minus error with a sand dune. And that is kind of where the sequence ends, unless on top we have the younger LSA deposits. But for the MSA, this is the sequence where we are mainly interested in, and the M2 upper and the M1 layers, so the upper part of the sequence, are the layers that have the Stillway technocomplex and also have recovered a lot of the findings from shell beads to engravings and ochre pieces that have been interpreted to be indication for developments towards modern human behavioral advancement and higher technological advancement in these time periods, mainly concentrated in these upper strata. In terms of the objective of my study is, so I was able to raise some seed funding to try the leaf wax method in Blombos Cave. So we were able to get some pilot samples to test the method. That was basically the initial idea, to test if we can detect a signal. And now we are lucky to also have some data over the entire sequence that we are currently trying to interpret. So the objective for my approach here is that basically it would be brilliant if we could be as close as possible to link environmental changes with the archaeological evidence, and the best way obviously is to go into the archaeological sequence itself. And this is not a new thing. Obviously people have done that with a variety of environmental reconstructions. We just heard from the two previous speakers how this is also possible. I'm a big fan of the leaf waxes because they are widely abundant, and we are not limited by the occurrences, and we potentially also in the future might have a way that we can be quantitative rather than qualitative if we're able to calibrate the data we're getting in terms of, for instance, rainfall amount. So here you see me taking the samples. I was able to take 12 samples throughout the sequence. That was in February 2012. And here I'm gonna displaying how these samples lay on the sequence. So this is an overview from a recent paper of Magnus Harlan from the Sapiens Center as well, where you can see the projected artifacts and how their abundance changes through the sequence. So you can see obviously where strata have higher density accumulation of lithics and fauna material indicated by the dots, against also the time period progression and the different dating methods and the unit as defined by the archaeologists. And here you can see that I took almost samples throughout, and the yellow ones were the samples that I got a signal from, and the gray ones here in the lowermost part and also in the lower M2. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a measurement, and that might be interesting in itself why that is. In terms of age model, so I'm using the latest published Bayesian age model from Zenobia Jacobs that was done on Blombos Cave. You can see here a figure from her paper that summarizes this Bayesian age model over time. So when I plot the data, you can see these uncertainties in age that come from that approach and the analytical uncertainty. So just briefly back to the methods. So I'm using long chain n-alkanes. These are coming from apicular waxes. And this is just the code, the waxing of plants, and it's on the outer surface. And obviously this comes with the plant remains into the sites, or is preserved in the archives. And when we look at the general n-alkane abundance changes, that can give indications what type of vegetation we look at and how that might have shifted through time. When we look at the carbon isotopes of the n-alkanes, that can also give indications if we're looking at a C3, C4 COM representation of species. We can also measure the hydrogen isotope composition of these n-alkanes, and they can tell you, for instance, about the hydrological cycle that the plant is obviously taking the water out from, and that can be driven by, for instance, by moisture source changes. It can also be driven by precipitation amounts of rainfall changing, and obviously all these proxies, they have also multiple options of in which way they can be interpreted. So this is not an ultimate proxy, but I think we have some methods now to also kind of rule out other options, to narrow options out what the proxies are actually driven by. And obviously very helpful to understand the climate dynamics in that time period, to look at regional climate modeling. So here comes results part one. This is the cross plot between the carbon preference index on the bottom and a general n-alkane average chain length distribution. And you can see the 9 samples of Blombos in blue here in the upper top, and you can see also labeled the squares that is modern reference data from Andrew Carr's work. And also in comparison, you can see burning experiments on maize and rye. That shows you some indication about how burning, or if you pick a sample from a very burned strata in the site, can affect basically your preservation. And this is a method to check like how significant is the contribution of the terrestrial material that we actually detecting, how well is this preserved, and do we have an issue with an overprint, for instance, because it has been burned. So what you can see is that we have high CPI values and a good distribution of the chain lengths. So it indicates, and we're sitting somewhere between a Karoo and a lowland fynbos soil in a modern. So this is like where we want to be. And we're also not within the range of what the chain length distribution would be if this would be heated to 500 degrees or 400 degrees. So we are nicely happy that we actually sitting in a good preserved environment here, and that we can actually go forward and trying to interpret the data in the isotopes or in the n-alkane abundance changes. So here comes the summary figure for the data now. So here I have the sequence again. So we're going obviously here again from oldest to the youngest, and you see the samples on the equivalent strata plotted. And now you have to kind of swap your version or your mind in terms of how the data is now plotted. So the oldest sample that you see here in the sequence is obviously the most left in the plot. So we're moving time-wise from left to right. So the oldest is to the left, and the most recent time period in Blombos is to the right. And then you can also see the deuterium isotope signature of modern soils from the different rainfall groups plotted here in comparison. And here's the deuterium isotope values with more depleted on top and more enriched values in the bottom. And in reference, we have a sea level curve. Why this is interesting, I'm going to explain in a minute. But what you can pick up is that through time, with a lowering sea level in the area towards marine isotope stage 4, what we can see is, and then I should obviously explain what the data points are. So the gray diamonds are the individual measurements of these 9 samples, and the black stars are the average of these units as defined by the archaeologists. So I averaged basically the M3, the M2, M1, and so on. So when you do that, so first of all, you see that when you look at the single measurements, we have quite some variability in the values within the units. So we have quite a high intra-unit variability in the leaf-wax deuterium isotopes. But if we average the units over time, we see the trend towards more enriched values. So we can see also that compared to the modern reference data set, for instance, one way to interpret this is that we're moving towards a source that older was, for instance, more potentially a source from the winter rainfall zone towards something that is more local, that is more year-round rainfall, moisture source for the rain in nearby Blombos Cave towards the time period when we have the lowest sea level approaching in the area. Another way to interpret this is that we have a trend towards more evapotranspiration in the area. So this could be more summer droughts, for instance. It could generally also be interpreted as a decrease in rainfall over time. I'm going to try to narrow these options a bit further down, but these are the couple of options that we're looking at when we look at the time series progression here. In panel C here on the bottom, what you can see is that I averaged the 9 samples on their abundances. And there is again a modern reference data set. And what you can see is that we're really nicely on the chain length distribution plotting on top of what we would expect to see from a lowland fynbos fingerprint. So we're nicely recording what we would expect in that area. Here is a quick how does that compare to other records? And here I've been rather selective and have not yet made this a bigger comparison with other records. So I have looked at the ostrich eggshelf isotope data that Patrick Roberts published, also for Blombos Cave, and that is the figure here where you see the carbon and the oxygen isotopes, and James Collins' work from Deep Blue Fork Shelter, where he also applied the leaf wax method. And interesting what both find for the same time period that I will show the data from Blombos Cave is that over time towards stage 4 on the oxygen isotope data from Patrick, but also from James's data from the leaf waxes in Deep Luft, both seem to agree what our data shows, that we have a trend towards more arid conditions, potentially more local year-round rainfall sources over that time period. We know that sea level variability on the Southern Cape has been especially important, and it has been recently very nicely shown from the LGM compilation from Curtis Marine's work and group. And we also know that obviously for marine isotope stage 4, here on the sea level curve has been another kind of benchmark, not as low as the LGM, but definitely also based on the reconstructions from Haley and others, that the area in front of Blombos Cave basically was strongly land exposed, and that might matter for multiple things. And what we wanted to know in the project is, like, when we lower the sea level and we expose the land, how is the local hydroclimate responding to this? And we can actually test this with climate modeling. So this is downscale climate modeling. This is very similar to also what Engelbrecht et al. Did for the LGM downscaling. Here we're using the Norwegian Earth System model, and we're downscaling with WRF. We're downscaling to 12 kilometers, and Ozan, my colleague in the project, is doing this, and we're trying to combine these data sets now. So what you can see here is that he takes the land exposure and implements it in the model for a sea level low equivalent for around 70,000 years ago, so almost in stage 4, beginning of stage 4. And then we're looking at the dynamical imprint of this exposed land in the model, especially with interest for these sites. And what we find in the model is, this is here wind and precipitation for different seasons here in the zoom in, and also for annual mean, is when we compare a model run that we didn't change the land exposure, so we didn't implement the sea level exposure, versus where we do that, we see a strong drop in precipitation, so 40% less precipitation on a seasonal basis. That obviously then results in an annual mean also reduction in precipitation, and it seems to be quite strongly also be concentrated on the coastal sites where these sites are located. And also interesting, I show a second plot soon, is also that we have quite some heterogeneous picture that is interesting if we obviously start comparing with other records on a more wider scale. So we have done another experiment where we take now the 70 Ka max land experiment, and we take it in comparison to an 82, so stage 5, but we're also cooling the ocean, because we know that towards stage 4, the Gallows current was significantly cooling at that time. And what we see is basically what we saw before. So we have a strong aridification and a decrease in the winds. However, the response is much more pronounced than when not cooling the ocean. So again, these sites become very much reduced in precipitation, and a westerly component is reduced in the wind system. But you see, interestingly, also that some areas become significantly more humid. So what does this mean now if we compare this with the archaeological evidence? And here I'm back to Magnus's paper, where he looked at the site usage from Blombos Cave over time, and that was just recently published, where Magnus finds that the time period that is most heterogeneous and is characterized by more frequent but short-term visits is also the time period where most of the behavioral evidence was recovered, in comparison, obviously, to these older strata, like here the M3 layer, which is more in the marine isotope stage 5B, C domain in terms of age, where the evidence or the material culture is much more uniform and is more associated with long-term modes of occupation, probably also related, of course, significantly to the distance of the marine sources to the cave site with a higher sea level at that time. And so Magnus has interpreted that as like the increased cultural complexity we find in these younger strata and the still big complex might be also goes hand in hand with a higher residential inland mobility. So people might have wandered further because we see that the site gets much more continental, and we have now kind of back this up with the leaf wax data, because what we're seeing is that the D-wax changes are actually co-occurring with the site usage changes. So with this site becoming the site usage changes that can be identified, we're also seeing that the site, the climate at the site becomes much more continental and potentially more arid. And we can obviously and need to further check how this really on a one-to-one basis comes together, but obviously much more population interaction or more inland mobility and change of habits and behavior related to that might be obviously an option. So I want to try to, I realize obviously a lot of information in a short time frame. We were able to get a signal from the waxes, which wasn't clear to start with. That's why we did pilot study data. There is a suggest of shift in hydroclimate over this time period covered. And this can, the hydroclimate shifts can be interpreted in different ways in terms of why this is what it means. So one way is increased aridity at Blombos Cave, with a shift towards potential more local rainfall source rather than other sources, east and west. It could also, as I said before, be a result of increased evapotranspiration just by higher land temperatures, but I think the evidence suggests that the temperatures are rather dropping than are getting warmer towards stage 4, so I would potentially rule this out. It could also, so the hydrogen isotopes could also be just shifting because you change the plant type that is preserved, but then it would mean that you need to have a change also to more arid adapted vegetation that seems a little bit tricky at the moment. I'm looking into the site vegetation reconstructions. I think we're not quite seeing that yet. And also the abundance data doesn't indicate from the leaf waxes itself that the fynbos is changing significantly to something else over the sequence. The model experiments where we test this coastline shifts and the land exposure shows that actually when you add the land in front of Blombos Cave, it gets much more continental climate over coastal South Africa, including these locations. And so it becomes much more seasonal. So we have like the interseasonal and diurnal ranges of temperature become much more pronounced. So the further away the sea is, the cooler the nights and the winters around Blombos Cave. And additionally, we can also see that we have a weakening of the westerly wind component, and that goes along with the reduction in the rainfall in this area, probably explaining the reduction in the model. And that would also potentially mean that we're getting a reduction in the winter rainfall component along with this reduction of the westerly component. So there is some way ahead. So I'm now on my way to integrate this in more detail with this with the local site evidence from the other paleoecological data that exists from Blombos and the archaeology, and then also obviously spanning that further beyond and comparing with the wider evidence over this time period. Obviously, just one note, very interesting that the coastline areas seem to show this aridification towards marine isotope stage 4, where some other records would indicate that stage 4 was more humid. So with this, I'm happy to take questions or comments, and we probably can start the discussion.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Margie. It's super exciting to see your early results there. I imagine there's going to be quite a few questions, so perhaps we open it up. I've just posted a link there to the Plant Conservation Unit's crowdfunding, so please do, if you've joined us since the beginning of this, please do have a look at that. Do we have any questions for, okay, Andrew? And then Curtis, I think, put his hand up.
Great. Thanks for that talk, Margit. I thought it was really interesting and really well presented. I had one question that I wasn't sure I understood, and so I just wanted to ask you for a clarification about a very general subject, sort of the fluctuation of winter and summer rainfall. And I always thought of the year-round rainfall as a mixed model of both sources. And in one of your diagrams, actually, it was the other way around. And I wondered if you could explain what that means.
You mean the other way around? In what sense?
Well, you had actually the winter and the summer. There was it was the main data graph where you showed the plotting of the different M3, M2 lower, M2 upper, and M1, and there was sort of a trend towards year-round rainfall.
Exactly.
I recall.
Yeah.
And year-round rainfall was actually outside of the range of summer and winter, and that confused me. And so I wanted to ask you if you could explain how that can be.
Yeah, so this is reference modern soil data in terms of when you measure the leaf waxes in the soils, what the signature of a winter rainfall leaf wax would be versus summer and a year-round one. And it looks like I think you can definitely have the shift of, if we think about the year-round rainfall zone getting like 50-50 equally today, that some of this equal distribution is dropped towards the dominance of one or the other systems, so that the majority of the rainfall just comes from one or the other, or that something locally is very locally specifically produced and dominates the system. So that's probably what it would be. For instance, if the ocean area locally on the Southern Cape, for instance, would warm significantly, you could have like local evaporation from the ocean, and then you would get a very local signal. For instance, if the Agulhas current would have warmed over that time period, it could explain why you would get more local influence. So it is probably a shift between getting away from the today 50-50 idea towards a dominance of one or the other, or towards a more local source. I hope that helps.
Okay, yeah, that actually answers it perfectly, because I was just assuming there had to be a third source then, and now you've clarified that, and I thank you.
You're welcome.
Curtis, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did have a question. Very nice talk. That's exciting work. If I remember correctly, in the one slide, you showed that there was one strata at Blombos where you didn't have the leaf wax preservation, and then below and above there was really good preservation. Did I see that correctly? And if so, what is it that would cause that one layer in the middle to be missing the leaf waxes?
Yeah, I tried to bring it up again. I just have this up now in not in a presenter mode, but I hope everyone can see that.
Yep, can see it. Good.
Yeah. So so is this M2 lower phase, and
Okay.
down here in the more sandy CP phase, and there can be multiple reasons. I looked at it earlier and I thought, wow, that looks really burnt, doesn't it? So it could be that it was just like very intensively fire used unit, that basically the signal is not preserved because it is like too burnt. It was just it's just gone. I think the organics, it could be one reason. The other reason is if layers a bit more sterile, this comes down to how do these components actually get into the site, and if there's a time period where people would bring less, and it is maybe just well, let's call it abandoned, and it's just mainly animals, or I would think that we get less material brought in that we could preserve and measure. So it's probably a component between accumulation or human activity versus too much human activity and not preserved because it's overprinted. But there might be more that I'm not aware of, so please let me know.
Does pH affect it at all?
Maybe. I would have to look into it. Can't say.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. We have a fun question from Asi Tandile for Chappie, which kind of touches on a whole mess around calibrated dates. Do you want to quickly answer that, Chappie? Just the importance of calibration for... Oh.
I was just I was just writing I was writing to what was the? I can't remember.
You were going to put it in the chat.
Yes, I was just about writing to him an email responding. Well, basically what I put here is that the quantities of radiocarbon in the atmosphere have fluctuated in the past in a non-linear fashion. So in a way, not the way we would have predicted. In order to obtain more accurate dates, a correction, so to speak, had to be included, which is what the calibration is. I don't know. I mean, you, Emma, have dealt with calibration way more than any one of us here, so maybe you could add a little bit further, perhaps.
Yeah, it's basically a very complicated question. So I'll be very happy to send you some answers. Perhaps though we'll move on. I thought there was a nice question for Alison. Don't know if you saw that, Alison, about how reliable or how useful acacia is. Did you want to address that? I think Abraham unfortunately has left.
Okay. I mean, I didn't actually do a vegetation reconstruction, but he is quite right. I mean, especially Acacia Karoo is an invasive species, and if they're clearing it for crop farming and things like that, with cattle in the area, it can invade into the area. But okay, let me just think. So they could have been brought in because they're very prevalent in the area now. There's probably more Acacia Karoo than anything else. But yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm like waffling here.
No problem. That's
sure. I would say that that Ndondondwani site is very, very unusual in that so much of the wood or the charcoal is actually acacia. There are other trees that have been used or types of wood that have been used in different parts of the site in younger layers, but even in the younger layers, most of the wood that is used in that site is acacia, which is very unusual. I've never, not that I've done that much, but I haven't seen that anywhere else. But I would say that as some of the species of acacia, not all of them, but Acacia Karoo certainly, since it is invasive or can be invasive, it probably is that's probably why it is so prevalent in the area today, maybe. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
And we have time for another question from Justin for Margit as well. Have you seen this one, Margit? About comparing your data with the Sealy isotopes from Burmplast.
No, I haven't, but I also wonder, isn't that younger time period?
You should have an MIS5 possibly at the base, which could be compared.
Okay, yeah, now I will. I have a look into it. Just in my head, Blombos is younger, but yeah.
I have a question actually, Margit. It's about sort of how the temporal resolution of your record, and whether you know that high variability that you're seeing in each level. If you're potentially just getting quite a short signal, or how much sampling you would need to do to sort of make sure that you're averaging out any kind of temporal noise, I guess.
Yeah, that's the story of my current life of archaeological site age models, because within a unit, what is the time actually that we look at? If I have, or even within a layer, right? As we don't have the accuracy so much to really pin this down between layers. So this is a challenge in terms of, is it hundreds of years, is it thousands of years, is it 2 weeks between fires that we're looking at? I don't think we really know. And yeah, so my plan is if I would be able to, so this was just 30% of what you could sample. So I also want to know in terms of if you reproduce, is it reproducible within the same layers across the walls, for instance, and how robust are the thickness, and are these variabilities real? And then probably even we might struggle with a temporal resolution between the data points. I think it will then be very interesting in terms of at least we can still compare to the same archaeological findings or the same paleoenvironmental findings, even though we don't know the actual absolute age between those, right?
Yeah, that's, I mean, it's super exciting work. It'll be very interesting to see how we can extend it as well to other sites outside of the Southern Cave. Do we have any more questions? Because we actually are at time. Okay, Lynn, did you want to make a final announcement?
I'm just going to share my screen to just advertise the next session, which is split into 3. Hopefully you can see that. So in June, we have 3 talks on the 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd, hosted by Vincent Hare. So I hope to see you guys all then. I don't have anything else really to say. Emma?
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really nice to connect with everyone like this, even though, yeah, hopefully next year.
Yes.
And thanks for stopping in. And thank you again to all our speakers. That was fantastic. And from 3 continents as well. Very impressive.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.